Hello, everybody, and welcome to this penultimate session of our ASPG meeting. My name is Angela Casey. I'm the Director of the Parliamentary Education Office for the Parliament of Australia. To start our session today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where we're meeting. For me, here in Canberra, it's the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and my home not far from here, it's the people of the Yuin Nation. I pay my respects. It's just wonderful to have these opportunities to meet virtually in these times to consider matters of Parliament and procedure. And I was reflecting with my colleagues earlier in the week that it's a very stimulating experience for parliamentary educators because we're processing the information in two ways at once. We are, of course, building our parliamentary knowledge, but we're also considering that content and thinking about how it could be interpreted, shaped, and purposed to help students build an understanding of our parliamentary democracy and system of government, and more importantly, become enthused and engaged with that system of government. So today, I'm just so pleased to have a conversation with parliamentary educators from 4 different jurisdictions: the Australian Parliament, the Parliament of New South Wales, the Parliament of South Australia, and the New Zealand Parliament. And each educator is going to talk to us about a different approach that's been taken in their parliament to teaching checks and balances. A few housekeeping matters. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can, at any time, click on that and pop a question in that you might have of one of our panellists. And at the end of the session, you can also use the virtual raise hand if you'd like to ask a question of a panellist. But that's enough from me. Our first speaker today is Amanda Paroz. Amanda is the Education Manager for the Parliamentary Education Office at the Australian Parliament. And Amanda is going to be speaking to us about how the committee system in the Senate can be a powerful tool to engage students with the concepts of checks and balances. Amanda.
Good afternoon. My name is Amanda Paroz and I'm the Education Manager at Australian Parliament House. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you today about how we engage young Australians with the concept of transparency, checks and balances using our federal committee system. And to kick it off, I actually have some very grim tidings. I need to let you all know that teenagers are not as excited about parliamentary process and transparency as we are. I know it is difficult news to hear, but we here at the Parliamentary Education Office work really hard to interpret the work of our committees, the work of Parliament, to explore the concept of checks and balances. And today I would like to take you through 3 examples and 3 ways we do that to bring this to life for students. So the first way we do this is we have, goodness me, tech fun. We have our committee system. Now, our federal committees are a wonderful gift for all parliamentary educators. We know that when we're working with young people that it's about accessibility and relatability. And we start our discussions about the federal committee system by noting that we've always had committees. But in 1970, when we saw the start of permanent committees in the Senate, we noticed a big change. We started accessing community expertise. Our members, our senators, were able to become more informed about complex matters. And this in turn was able to help us inform our legislation. And of course, we saw an increase in scrutiny in our government. Now, the idea of committees, the idea of that collegiality is really important, and we want to raise awareness for young people about that. We saw in 2019 the NAPLAN Civics and Citizenship results. For students in Year 10, only 55% had strong trust in our government and in the work of our Parliament. And that's really concerning. For a lot of young people, what they are seeing on TV, on their social media more often, are our politicians arguing, disagreeing, And that can erode young people's trust. By exploring the work of committees, looking at how they're able to work together, to negotiate, to explore these really complex ideas, it helps build that confidence in young people. The ability for teachers to access current committee information on the Australian Parliament House website is also a wonderful boon. We're seeing here that our teachers and students are able to find out what is happening in Parliament at the moment with committees. They're able to get involved in committees that they are interested in, to prepare a submission that will be read. And this is really important. It's empowering young people to let them know that although they may not be of a voting age, they have a real, authentic, tangible way to get involved. And what I've got next to me here, we actually see students from Wodonga College, and they are at a public hearing for a joint committee exploring the lowering of the voting age. And what was really powerful for these students was that they were able to be part of the process. Now, unfortunately, we can't give every teacher in Australia who's studying civics that moment where they can go, excellent, I'm taking my group to a public hearing, let's find out a bit more about checks and balances. It's not always possible. So how do we get that engagement? What we've done is taken that expertise of the committee system and we have turned it into our committee role play. And the committee role play is excellent. It's an immersive learning experience for our young Australians. They are able to study things that are important to them. It gives them an understanding of that negotiation work. It gives them the chance to research, to get involved, to share their findings, which is really relatable for them. Our students are doing this for their assessment tasks. And by utilising the committee role play, they're able to transfer their understanding of that work they do to what is happening in committees. Now, what we have here are some of our students from Year 11 from the National Youth Science Forum, and they're actually undertaking a committee role play looking at nuclear power in Australia. And what we have are students breaking into interest groups to explore different areas of nuclear power, and they're coming to discuss their findings with their committee, also known as their colleagues in the classroom. And those committee members will then put together a report to share. So this ability to be able to transfer what is happening here at Parliament House into the classroom is exceptionally powerful. But how do we get that information out? And that is our third prong approach. That is our teacher professional learning program. By doing teacher professional learning, and especially using the joys of Zoom and a green screen, we are able to get information out further. Here in the Federal Parliamentary Education Office, we have a national remit, and being able to connect with teachers is powerful. If you get one teacher, you're accessing at least 30 students. And let's be honest, us teachers love to share a resource and a gossip in the office. So we know that this information is going to push further out. And we know that by also working with our wonderful colleagues in our state parliaments and also in different national institutions, such as the High Court and also the National Archives, we're really able to share that expertise and demonstrate to teachers just how parliamentary checks, balances and transparencies operate not only in federal parliament, but across all of our system of government and how it interacts with the different arms of government. So, committees, why they are important. It's accessible for young people. It allows them to connect and relate. It helps build trust. It acts as a launch pad for them to engage with different methods of scrutiny, of transparency, of checks and balances. And most importantly, it's a powerful way to engage them in an authentic process and to help build that trust and understanding of the work of our Parliament. Thank you very much. You're on mute.
Thank you. The catchphrase of 2022, I believe, you're on mute. And indeed I was, but I am no longer. Thank you, Amanda. That was a great insight into the Senate committee system and how we're able to use it in the Parliamentary Education Office. We will, of course, take questions from participants at the end, but I might just sneak a a sneaky little question into you now, Amanda, if I can possibly articulate it. Obviously, the Senate role play that the PEO does is a terrific way to engage young people. But if you could pitch another initiative that would help increase youth understanding of and engagement with our committee system, what would it be?
I am going to propose something a little out there. In an ideal world, if we could make this happen, what I think would be super powerful would actually have a youth or student committee, a group of students from across Australia who would be available for different committees to engage with and to be able to get a clear voice from young people about a variety of issues.
Thank you, Amanda. I think that idea is brilliant, actually, and I could see how such a reference group could be useful to other parts of the Parliament as well. Thank you. Our next speaker is Jeannie Douglas. Jeannie is a Senior Manager within the Parliamentary Education and Engagement Unit at the Parliament of New South Wales. And today, Jeannie's going to be talking to us about a range of different programs that the New South Wales Parliament uses to teach the idea of checks, balances and transparency. Thank you, Jeannie.
Thank you very much, Angela. I'd just like to add to Angela's acknowledgement. I'm coming to you from Redfern, which is Gadigal land, home of the Eora people, and I acknowledge and pay my respect to Aboriginal people online on our online audience today. So I thought it was really interesting what Amanda had to say, and I think what you'll hear from Natalie and I and Carolyn and Amanda today will be very similar messages, because I could see in what Amanda was saying very similar to what we do at the New South Wales Parliament. I think what we were talking about today too is the challenges of engagement, and to try and work out more and more ways and devise innovative ways of getting our students and our community to engage with the work of the Parliament. So in parliamentary education and engagement, we take a lot of time to devise ways of explaining the complex work of the legislature. So we have to kind of simplify it and break it down. And we do this for both New South Wales citizens and students to help them understand both the work of the Parliament and their civic role, and the way the process of legislation. And of course, this would incorporate understanding the checks and balances that ultimately make our democracy stronger. So we, in education, similar to what Amanda was saying, we do this through workshops and programs, but for engagement with community, we have a couple of different programs that we put on throughout the year, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about those. We also have some open days, but I won't focus on those today. So our community engagement programs, we have two different formats. One is called Parliament Unpacked, which is kind of what it sounds like it would be. And the other one is a house talk. So the house talks will feature an invited speaker or guest. We frequently use Professor Anne Toomey to talk about something about the Constitution. And we also have historical ones. Our Parliament, the oldest Parliament in Australia, was originally the Rum Hospital. So we've had some interesting talks as well about how it went from the Rum Hospital to the first legislature. So that's our house talks. So today I'll focus on our Parliament Unpacked program. So the way the Parliament Unpacked program works is that we in education think up something about the Parliament that's out there in the community that they hear on the radio or in the news or whatever, and they think they don't really understand what that is. Now, one of those is the one that Amanda gave, the example of committees. So we have actually had a Parliament Unpacked on committees. And we've had a variety of others. So I'll just take you through some of those. So the format of a Parliament Unpacked is we have a panel of members, and we try to get members from the upper house, the lower house, male, female, different parties. So we try to get a really good cross-section of members. And the opportunity is for the members to speak directly to the community, both online and physically in our buildings. So we run it simultaneously. The idea there is that the members are speaking directly to the community. So it's not filtered through the media, which I noticed Amanda commented on as well, like getting straight to the member, from the member to, in this case, the community. So they explain their role. They have an opportunity to speak for a few minutes each. We usually have to time them so they don't get carried away. And then they have the opportunity to answer questions from the floor. Either that's online through the chat box, as you can do today, or physically in the one of our rooms. So some of the programs we've had, as I mentioned, we've had one with committees, and we focused on a couple of different committees. We sometimes, just to kind of mix things up a bit, we actually hold the event in the chamber, and for the one for committees, we held that in the upper house chamber. We also had one earlier this year called Conflict, Collaboration and Conscience Votes. And this was also about the way members work across the aisles. And I think that's really important that Amanda used the word collegiality, which also comes up in our programs. The members often talk about how they work together. We also had another one towards the end of last year called the Crossbench, Power, Procedure and Passion. And that's meant to be slightly referencing that Midnight Oil song, but let's not go there. So that was on in November last year, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And another one we had also last year was the role of the Attorney General, because we figured that you hear the word Attorney General on the radio, on the news all the time, and you think, well, who is this person? And so we kind of got a number of Attorney Generals, 3 of them, 2 past and 1 present, and they talked about how the law intersects with the lawmaking body. And there was some really good questions from the audience on that day. So looking at the crossbench program, as I said, we try to come up with different ways of allowing the community to better understand the work of the legislature. So in November last year, it was a 1-hour program. Because of COVID, it was all online. So the program was introduced by the President, and we also had the Clerk of the Parliaments involved in the actual program. So he was assisting with questions. We had a member of the Greens, One Nation, and the Shooters and Fishers. So rather than focusing on the lower house, we chose to just do the crossbench of the upper house. And the reason for our choice is that the upper house is the House of Review, as you would know, but also the government does not have a majority in the upper house. So we felt that the crossbench would be very interesting in the upper house. Not that it's not interesting in the lower house, but we just thought the way they operate in the upper house might be really interesting to the community. So the clerk started it by, we have to always be aware that the community don't often understand any of the terminology and any of the ways that we work in the Parliament. So the clerk gave a great introduction after the President, and he talked about the integral role of the crossbench. He talked about the upper house being the House of Review, and just that role of holding the executive or the government to account. And that the crossbenchers participate in the negotiation process with the government. The 3 members then answered a series of questions. And as I mentioned before, and also Amanda mentioned, what sort of comes out of all of our programs is that once there's nothing between the member and the community or the member and the students, they do talk about how they work together to make legislation better for the people of New South Wales. And I really like the way that always comes out, always somewhere in our programs that will come out. So the members all agreed. They may have come at it from different angles. As you can imagine, the Greens and the Shooters and Fishers don't always sit on the same page, so we say. But what came out is a general agreement about the role of the crossbenchers. And since 2019, we have 11 crossbenchers in our upper house of a house of 42. So you can see that they then have the casting vote. So the government don't have the majority. They talked about how they've tried to modernise the upper house to improve scrutiny and transparency. And they've done this by making changes to the sessional orders. And this, as they say, required a landmark cooperation between the crossbench members. They really want to maximise the opportunities to hold the government to account, to make it more transparent. They also talked about and this is a case where members will throw around words that the audience, I'm sure, thinking, what are you talking about? But they were openly talking about Standing Order 52. So even I wasn't sure what Standing Order 52 was. And they were talking about how there's a lot more Standing Order 52s every day now in the chamber than there was previously. And what I really like about when you have an online audience or an audience in front of the members is I think it's a sign that they are really listening and they were really engaged, because we didn't get very far before a visitor said, an online question appeared, can you please tell me what an SO52 is? They say standing order, and then they immediately said SO52, SO52. It's a secret terminology. So, and then of course, one of the members, the Honourable Robert Borzak, gave a very good explanation as to what that is, about a call for all government papers. And this again goes to scrutiny and transparency and checks and balances. A notice is given in the House, and the government have 14 to 21 days to supply all papers on a particular topic. It's a unique power of the upper house to drill down into government papers, to find out what's going on, to get an audit trail, to get an email trail, to find out what contracts, all of that sort of thing. And the fact that this came up a number of times with the crossbenchers, it's also obviously something that they consider critically important. The crossbench see their mandate is to be the house of review, to put the brakes on sweeping government mandates, to hold the government to account. And they mentioned that, all three of them mentioned that a number of times. So we in education will continue to, like they do in all the legislatures, we'll continue to try and think up ways of unpacking. That's why it's called Parliament Unpacked. Unpacking what goes on in the legislature. We're currently planning our next one for it's beginning of June, and we're going to focus on the role of the whip. So that should be quite interesting. So we'll have whips from the lower house and the upper house, and they'll talk about their role. So I think that's all from me, Angela.
Jeannie, thank you so much. That was really interesting. As you started to speak about the program, I thought, oh, I'm going to ask you about, you know, whether you've had particular and unique reflections, particularly say from the crossbenchers, about the particular power that they have in the Parliament. But you've done such a great job of describing it. I don't think I need to go there. Just a small piece of commentary on SO52. Yes, the act of parliamentary education is often one of translation indeed. We did have a question come through the channel, though, that I might just ask you, from a colleague in Western Australia who was wondering, on average, how many participants do you usually have turning up for these programs?
In the building itself, we usually get about 60 to 80. And then we might have 150 or so online. I mean, obviously that varies from topic to topic. If it was a house talk with Professor Anne Toomey, she appears to have quite a few groupies. So we get quite a few people coming. So it just depends on the topic. And we have a communications team, a media communications team that really push it out there through Facebook and all the other platforms. So we really try hard to get out there and get as many people attending both online and in person as possible. We only discovered and found we had the technology to do things online during COVID, yet another one of the few blessings of COVID, but we did actually work that out because we had to. And so it's been fantastic because we can get all the regional audiences, and in Western Australia, you know, with the being such a large state, it's really important that we do provide that platform, the online platform.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeannie. We'll move on now to our next speaker. Caroline Wallis is a senior educator at the Parliament of New Zealand. Sorry for the stumble there, Caroline. And today, Caroline's going to be talking to us about initiatives to incorporate student voice that can enhance the teaching of checks and balances. And I think, you know, the clear thread throughout all of the presentations so far is about relevance and resonance for audience. So I'm very interested to hear what you have to say, Caroline, about how actually incorporating the voice of the audience can further enhance an education program. Carolyn.
Thanks, Angela. Tēnā koutou. Ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, ko Wallis te hapu, ko Caroline aho, ko taku turanga waiwai, ko turanga nui a kiwa, he Kaitohutohu Matua Mātauranga, e mahi anu ahau ke parimata. So thank you for allowing me to introduce myself in Māori. My name is Caroline Wallis. I just told you that I work as a senior education advisor and that my turanga waiwai, which is the Māori word for where I stand, I reference where I'm from, which is a place called Gisborne or Turanga Nui a Kiwa on the east coast of the North Island. So I'm going to do the brave screen share. No one's done it yet. And I was hoping that someone would have done it by now and like gone, oh, it goes like that. I mean, how hard can it be? But as you can see by the color of my hair, sometimes, you know, you go, is that going to work okay? Is that going to work okay? All right. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to a slideshow from the beginning. That's that bit done. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about a little bit about some ideas around teaching checks and balances, but also I just want to touch on challenges around that and some possible responses that educators have to responding to those challenges. I feel like I'm preaching to the converted here with this wonderful team and many of you out there in Education Parliament land. It's really important to have a really well-resourced and delivered civics and citizenship education. And although we know that, it's incredibly important now in a lot of the space that our young people are in, and in the space that a lot of our communities are in. You know, delivering that education via programs, whether they're on site, online, whether it's about making really strong connections and building relationships with stakeholders, whether it's about thinking about how can we best find out what we need to know how to deliver. We've got the lens that we've always used, but our lens may come through our own Western point of view about how we should translate information. And I think that now's a time for thinking about ways that we can perhaps broaden how we share the message. I did put in there just on the slide, there has been recent research, and I'm sure that many of us feel it in our gut. There's a sense that the trust in democratic processes is declining. There has been research which has come out that says that there are some real emerging threats just in general to social cohesion in the world. And some of those threats come through in terms of how people view like a social or civic institution. So their distrust in government, their distrust in the process, there's some real things emerging. And a lot of that, there's reasons for that. They're to do with how media reports, how people, lack of understanding and knowledge, which is where our role comes in. But a really key part of what we do is demystifying how government works so that they understand that there are checks and balances and there isn't these very broad brushstrokes kind of generalizations made about the way that things work. So that's why it's important. I thought I'd start with that. There are challenges in doing it. As has been pointed out, teenagers, yeah, primary school students as well. How do you take something like scrutiny and make that relevant to an 8-year-old? And so there are generic kind of challenges in terms of the terminology that's being used. I'm also interested in how, like in terms of New Zealand and our parliament, are there things as well that are unique to that? I'm feeling the heat in terms of being the only unicameral representative here, but we do find that there are things in the way that our parliament is set up, the way that it looks, that could be quite challenging for young people to connect to. And it's breaking through and making that connection, which means that then we can help them understand the way it works and help them understand that there are actually things built into that system that mean that there are checks and balances in place. So some of the challenges are for them to see in some of these spaces that there are different voices represented. I've just got like 3 images there. You'll see there's an image of our debating chamber. There's an image of what is above the Speaker's chair, which is actually the Royal Coat of Arms. It's not even the New Zealand Coat of Arms. And around Parliament House is the cipher that's at the bottom, which is the cipher of King George V. There's a lot in there to unpack for kids that shows that the voices that are represented in that space are very much based on a colonial history, very much based on this is a historical building of a period of time, and there are things in there that reflect that. We had in the last election of 2020, a Māori MP come in who said when he first walked into that space, now I know what it feels like when a Pākehā, an English person, walks onto a marae. There's you're walking into a space that has things in there that show that you're not from that space, if that makes sense. So I guess the challenge then is how to kind of allow that discussion, allow them to see that for what that is, but also allow them to talk about it, allow us to talk about it, support ways for them to still engage with that space, knowing that. And so it's just connecting with what is there and acknowledging what is there and understanding the history of how that got there, if that makes sense. I put at the bottom there as well that it's also really important to think about if we want to open up the space for them to talk about things, that also to critique historical influences as well. So those are the challenges. There are other challenges. I just thought I'd focus on those ones. Okay. The educators here will love the fact that I put pedagogical into a slide because that's our bread and butter. So some possible pedagogical approaches. Now, I have been looking into these. So this is not one where I say, I've looked into these and I've done all of them and here's the evidence. They have not yet been trialed, but they will be trialed. Some of them are actually existing in some of our work, but we're just kind of trying to formalize this a little bit more. So some approaches are finding student stories and sharing student stories with students. So student stories where they have engaged with a parliamentary process. Because we're unicameral, we feel like it's really important they understand the select committee system. That is where a lot of scrutiny occurs. That is where a lot of public opinion is heard. That is where we've got scrutiny of our financial reviews. So yeah, we do really focus on the select committee system, but also we focus on debate, oral questions and written questions. Another approach is parliamentary storytelling. Now, I found out about this via some research from the UK. And what that is it's kind of like this different kind, it's like a continuum of just say recording someone that's, if I use the picture that's down the bottom, petition of Sophie Hanford, that's a group of young people who, there was a petition on climate change. So parliamentary storytelling could be just taking that clip and just pushing it out. And there's no context given, it's just people can hear the voices. But one approach to parliamentary storytelling is that the educator, as in like it could be me, using that video to show to another group of students. So I'm like an intermediary. I'm like, and I provide the context of the words that are being used, perhaps, or the thing they're doing and where they are and why is that important. So it's like the educator's like the narrator in a way, helping tell the story. And the third approach, which actually builds into those two ones above it, is to really actively seek approaches which incorporate Māori concepts of belonging and participation, because our view of teaching has traditionally been very Western in terms of its concepts of what's important and how you deliver it. But using a te ao Māori lens provides another way for Māori learners to see that they have a place in terms of how things are viewed as well. So it's not just our lens of I've got information and this is how you're going to know about it, but ways for them to engage with material as well. This is where I think the exciting stuff happens in terms of moving forward. And the best way forwards that I am thinking of, again, using my own lens, is to just really open up that conversation in terms of acknowledging the impact of colonisation on the tangata whenua, the people of New Zealand, the Indigenous people in New Zealand, that those concepts are really important to talk about, to use a lot more te reo Māori in our delivery, and aligning it with the student stories. I've just got the other example there, to find stories which also show young people, I guess, talking about their sense of belonging and things they're unhappy with that are connected to a te Māori perspective. So that picture there shows a picture of Leah Bell and Waimarama Anderson. They petitioned Parliament. They were petitioning, asking Parliament to commemorate the New Zealand Wars, and as a result, a real discussion started happening a lot more. I think it was happening as well at the same time. There was no national day of commemoration for the New Zealand Wars in New Zealand, and this was in 2019, and there's a lot of discussion about it. Now, this year, the Aotearoa New Zealand History's curriculum, it is compulsory to teach Aotearoa New Zealand history up to year 10. And they were a part of that. They were a part of that discussion. And as a result, a wreath was put up in our debating chamber to commemorate the New Zealand Wars as well. It's a huge story, a really important story to be able to share. It kind of connects a little bit to what Amanda was talking about at the beginning, because actually that came about because, or that image there came about because that's from a video from our youth reference group. So if you're talking about youth on committees, we have a youth reference group which last year put out a whole lot of videos about processes. So they were a really helpful link as well. So yeah, just incorporating pedagogy, inclusive open questions, use of language from the people that live in New Zealand, all the official languages. I haven't learned sign language yet. And just really an emphasis on sharing stories and creating a safe space. So nā reira e te iwi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was deeply interesting. And I guess it's a great reminder to us, you know, we're talking about young people and where young people are at and making sure things are relevant and resonant. But we are, you know, it is also very good to be reminded that the act of interpretation that parliamentary education can be also needs to take into account that cultural dimension as well. And although our country's histories are different and the cultures of our Indigenous peoples are so different, I think we could have a fascinating conversation about those Maori concepts in education and what's being called the Aboriginal 8 ways of learning. So maybe for a future educators conference, that one, I think. But Caroline, I did want to say, it's a glowing story you're telling there, but I wanted to ask, how difficult is it to find these stories to incorporate into your teaching? Has it been a dream run?
No. There you go. There's your answer.
Thank you.
It is really challenging. Yeah. It's just no central repository, which makes me think maybe I should create one and I don't know, make money. But out of that, but I love my job too much. There's no central place where you go, oh, that's a story where somebody's engaged in that process and it all goes there and you've got all the audio and you've got all the video. Finding those stories, that was lucky our youth reference group focused on some processes to make videos about. Each year it's completely up to them what they do. We've got a different reference group this year. We don't know if they're going to do that. Rumors are they're going to use TikTok, but we don't know how far that's going to go. I think also we look for issues where we think, again, we look for prominent issues that we think that youth may be making submissions on, and then I basically trawl through the live streams and just look for stories. Some stories make it to the news, but there is a lot like that one where I've got the video evidence of somebody very young who had participated in the climate change protests, and also was speaking to a select committee. I found that through looking up climate change and looking at petitions and looking at live submissions and finding like it just takes a bit of time. But I just know that I've got to do it because I need to find where the submissions are. Our social media people are actually always really awesome as well. They can tell us if there's something trending on Instagram where there seems to be a lot of youth voice coming through because they're interested, like it might be a bill that's going through where there seems to be a lot of youth interest in it, then we'll put that on our radar. And the other way is that we have our year 13, which I think might be year 12, have achievement standards. I guess they're assessments that they have to take a form of social action that will influence some kind of policy change. And no, don't have to. I mean, like it's part of that. If you choose that course, that's what you do, you know. Oh God, if they could all do it, amazing. The select committee office will hate me for saying that though, but when a class is going to come in, they can tick the box and say we're doing that social action standard, and so we will really like target like our program for them, but also then it's really good to keep in contact with them so they can tell us if they're making submissions or if they're making petitions as a result of their visit with us or they're online, or we've written a resource to go along with that as well. So that's a long answer.
No, deeply interesting. Thank you, Carolyn. We'll move on to our final speaker now so that we have time for questions at the end. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Natalie Young, Community Education Officer at the South Australian Parliament, and I will say the most able wrangler of this panel of educators today. Natalie's going to broaden the conversation out a little bit for us now and talk about how teaching concepts that are a little bit broader than just parliamentary process can indeed reinforce these understandings we're aiming to communicate to our young people. Over to you, Natalie.
Okay, hi everybody. Nina Mani, which is welcome in Kaurna language, and I'm on Kaurna land at the Parliament of South Australia today. I'm the last speaker on the last day and the last panel of the ASPG conference on a Friday afternoon. So you're all very lucky that my default setting is energy level 500, and I will hopefully give you some really exciting coverage on how we teach the separation of powers. I wanted to touch on the separation of powers because this is broader than just the parliamentary concept, but really links nicely with the conference theme of checks and balances. So I'll touch on how we communicate the balance that's enforced by the separation of powers and then the checks that the different arms of government have on each other. So very much a broad focus from my session today. What I will talk about first is the balances side of things. The separation of powers as a concept lands in the Australian curriculum at year 7. And I think if you picked a year 7 off the street or even Joe Bloggs off the street and asked them to explain to you the concept of the separation of powers, you wouldn't get very much traction. Teaching the separation of powers isn't particularly exciting for a lot of people, and listening to the separation of powers isn't very exciting for a lot of people. So I've tried to reinvent the way that we teach it to make it a little bit more practical and hands-on, and hope that our visitors, so whether that's students or new arrivals or public sector employees, learn with a little bit more information than what they had when they started. So the first thing that I do with the separation of powers is explain the theory, and then we use a real example to, I guess, unpack what the different arms of government are doing. So one example that's been really helpful and quite generic is that you might have a parliament make a COVID-19 response law, then you have your executive arm of government who put it into action. So police can arrest people for breaches, or in South Australia, SA Health will implement the practices that are required under the COVID-19 response law. And then our judiciary would consider whether the law was made within its power if it were asked to do so, or if it was applied appropriately if it was asked to do so. So we try and begin by giving a real world example that demonstrates the different activities the various arms of government use. Then we move into a little bit of an exercise, which is quite illuminating, because if you try it with students, they're usually pretty comfortable with getting their responses wrong. But if you do it with a bunch of public sector employees and they awkwardly allocate themselves into the wrong arm of government, it can open up some, I guess, embarrassing but necessary conversations. So one of the things that we do through the Parliament of South Australia's education program is ask students, participants, to physically split themselves into the separation of powers. So they get a little card, and on the card there's a role, and it might be as simple as police officer, judge, this is the entry level, easy, senator, a minister, and they're asked to take their little card and move to an area that's designated Parliament, Executive or Judiciary. And then there's also a special place that's allocated as people who sit in more than one. So that way students have to actively think about some of the nuances of our Australian separation of powers. So in this instance, the students might say, oh, I'm a police officer, I'm in the executive, I'm a judge, I'm off in the judiciary, I'm a senator, I'm in the Parliament, and then they get to minister and stumble, which is a really great teaching opportunity for us to talk about the link between the Parliament and the executive in our Australian separation of powers. This activity that we do, I've created easy, medium and hard levels. So as we progress to medium, the titles get a little bit more elaborate. So we use more specific terminology. I think Ange and some of the speakers before indicated that terminology, SO 52, that's half of our problem. So we start integrating some of the parliamentary terminology when we get to medium level. And then finally, by the time we're at the advanced level, we're using real people, real names, real positions. And so that way they can see the application in the real world of the separation of powers. So it's a pretty interesting little activity. And I think that doing it with young people, but as well as adults, the information lands in a really meaningful way and makes it realistic and practical. So the next step to sort of elevate this is, once the students or the participants have been sifted into their different arms of government and we've unpacked why they're in Parliament, Executive, Judiciary or more than one, we talk about the practical implementation of the separation of powers. So how are they kept separate and why is this important? So we talk about, being on different computer systems from each other. So I can't personally access the global email address system, or I'm not on the global system for the executive arm of government because I'm an officer of the Parliament. And why would those be necessary? And we unpack using my favourite example, which is a sporting example. Like, you can't be the person who writes the sporting rules and umpire a player and a tribunal all at the same time. And then when we get to the more advanced students, so by secondary level, or if we're doing public sector training, we talk about how the different arms of government check each other. So if we get our parliamentarians who have separated themselves out, we say, how would you check on the executive, or how would you check on the judiciary? And so they can identify things like approval of regulations, question time, committee systems, and then you might get your executive arm to talk about how they supervise the other arms of government, which could be through non-judicial tribunals or making recommendations for legislative change. And then if we get the students or the participants who have been allocated as the courts, we can ask them to identify how they check on the Parliament through things like statutory interpretation or case law filling gaps in statute, and then conversely how the Parliament might respond with remedial legislation. So once we've physically communicated that concept of the balance between Parliament, Executive and Judiciary, we then have a little practical strategy to talk about checks, which has been really effective, I think. So at the moment, we're in the process of turning this into a bit more of a sophisticated card game. At the moment, they're little slips of paper that we have cut up and we hand out, but we're turning it into a deck of cards so the students can do multiple activities, understanding where they are in the separation of powers. But I would confidently hand them out to some of the adult groups that come through Parliament House, including our public sector employees. The feedback that we've received on this is that it's been landing more effectively because it's more realistic. And that they would like to see more strategies to teach the separation of powers, which is quite interesting because I think it's difficult enough in the first place, and this is a first step. So anyone in the ASPG community who has further suggestions on how to make what could be a fairly dry concept exciting and engaging are welcome to send me an email, and I will chew your ear off about it for as long as you like. So I'm hoping that with this structure in place, we will start to see a better public understanding of how things work. And I suppose from an education context, I'm starting to see less queries coming to my office about something to do with the courts, or we're noticing that the public are self-directing themselves to the appropriate vessel for their areas of governance. And I suppose in another day and another time, we could talk about this in the context of levels of government and how we can get people appropriately communicating with their councillors compared to approaching their state parliaments for a council issue or a federal issue. So I'll leave it there because we're getting close to the end of the session, and I think there were some questions to come through, but hopefully you can see that there are lots of fun ways to communicate checks and balances, and if anyone wants to play my game sometime and test your skills, I'm more than happy to send you through the materials. So thank you from SA.
Thank you so much, Nat. That was great. And, you know, again, a really useful reminder to us that while we completely understand that, you know, the pedagogy, the way we teach to young people will necessarily be different to the andragogy, the way we teach to adults, but that nonetheless, there are, you know, a bunch, I think they say there are 7 different learning styles out there, and young people can be kinesthetic learners, as can adults. And I think that that teaching strategy sounds fun, effective, and yes, please, I'll play the card game. So rather than ask you particularly about your program, Natalie, I might move to a general question to the entire panel now. So maybe, Natalie, you'd like to answer first. This is from Colleen Lewis. Does anyone on the panel have suggestions for how we could get the media to cover more than question time and a parliamentary committee when it is addressing a controversial issue? I have one thought, but I'm going to hold mine till the end.
And you would like me to go first, Ange? I'm feeling significant pressure.
Well, look, I'll go first if you like and say...
No, I have opinions. I'm just conscious of the audience and how many of my opinions I should share. And I think a lot of this comes down to media literacy in the general public and understanding what is trying to be achieved. I mean, news broadcasts don't want to show the unsexy parts of the day where you can see how smoothly a bill went through Parliament that day, where it was bipartisan, multi-partisan, and everybody agreed. So I think we need to have better media literacy practices for people to understand why they're being shown the things that they're being shown, and asking for better, like contacting news outlets and contacting members and saying, why aren't we seeing more coverage of some of the less controversial achievements that are coming through this place? Why aren't the media reporting on this? More people, I mean, this comes down to using your voice and having your say, but contacting media outlets and writing letters to the editor demanding better coverage of this kind of content. Because as long as the people are consuming it and the advertisers are getting the views that they would like based on showing the controversial things, then we're not going to see the uncontroversial stuff. But that's my humble opinion. But I will pass it over to the rest of the panel.
I think we need to consider what streams of media people are looking at as well. So I completely agree with media literacy. I think that's something a lot of parliamentary education officers are always going on about, but especially in the lead up to the federal election, we're having some really frank conversations about it. But I think we also need to consider, how are people consuming media? Back in ye olde good days, growing up, it was on the news, it was on the radio, and it was in the newspapers. But what we're seeing, in a way, for better and for worse, is the democratization of this information. we know that we've got our parliamentary content live streaming, but how that's then being used and interpreted and also put onto different channels. So Ozpol has a huge section of TikTok, for example. So people are not just looking for those main ideas, but they might be able to come in at it at a different way. So I think there's an importance of looking at the different way that information is going out and who is consuming it and where.
I think also like using students. I took a school group in once when I was teaching, and when we walked down the corridor, I said, something's going on, there's a whole lot of media here. And we went in the room and they were filming them because such is the novelty of young people speaking to a select committee. That's very like, we were a little bit like, didn't realise it was going to happen. But in a way, if that's a way to get some kind of media coverage about, and if the kids are comfortable with it, or the school or whatever is comfortable with it, getting that story out there, that's a really good way to kind of like see for the kids to see the value, but also to have a good news story out there as well.
I'm going to add my my little thought there at that stage, because it connects beautifully with yours, Carolyn, and that is, I don't know if anybody's come across Channel 6 News, but that is the place you need to be dialing in for your media information about what's going on in Parliament. Channel 6 News has been running for 4 years, I think. The key presenter is currently in Year 9. He does an amazing job. He got an interview with the Prime Minister just a couple of weeks ago. And I guess, so what I'm saying is absolutely student voice, but maybe encouraging other media outlets, which kind of kicks back to what Amanda was saying about taking advantage of platforms. Jeannie, did you have any comments you want to add there?
Yeah, I just think you've all got such good comments. I mean, you could start with Natalie forcing the journalist to play your game and take it seriously. I think you need to maybe you could educate the public, and we do this in some curriculums, English curriculum, I think, in New South Wales, on how the media work, how they operate, so they've got a better understanding of where the media are coming from. I don't know. That is a really, really hard question but I think we've all got some ideas. But yeah, I like that, Natalie. Can I just add to Natalie's game? Daniela in our New South Wales Parliament plays a game with chocolate wrappers where she explains proportional voting, preferential proportional voting with chocolate wrappers. It's so complicated, but at the end of it, I think students really get a sense of how it works.
Jeannie, you had me at chocolate. Absolutely. So look, we just have a minute or two left in our session. So I feel that probably we'll make some closing remarks and wrap up. If any of our panelists want to say anything, please jump forward at this time. Look, I think I can speak on behalf of everyone who's in this panel. As educators, we are all so incredibly aware of the great privilege that we have to work in these magnificent institutions and to communicate such noble and important messages for the next generation. We are so appreciative of sitting close to such parliamentary expertise in these buildings. You know, I think with our teacher professional learning programs, we've all had experiences of teachers who just feel a little inadequate. They just don't know the content, that they're worried and concerned. And for us to be able to tap into the expertise that sits within our parliament and have the opportunity to present that in a way that's engaging for our young people is a good reason to get out of bed. Look, we're at 2:29, so we're going to wrap up this penultimate session, and I'm going to thank you all for attending. Thank you for your questions, and I'm going to pass to Colleen Lewis now, the outgoing National President of ASPG, for the closing remarks session. Thank you everyone for joining our session today.
Hello, I'm presuming everybody can hear me. I want to start by offering many congratulations to the members of the Conference Organising Committee, Rachel Pineda-Lyon, Carolyn McVeigh, Dr. Vern Coops, Anja D'Alicio, and until a few months ago, Anik Owen. They put together what can only be described as a highly successful, interesting, and informative virtual conference. And I think sometimes it's harder to do a virtual conference than it is to do a face-to-face one. As a member of the Victorian chapter, I would just like to say to them all, you really did us proud, and thank you. Thank you to all members of the ASPG for the absolute honour of being the group's national president for some 7 years. I'm really passionate about the importance of our parliaments, and as a member of the Victorian chapter, will do what little I can to contribute to the strengthening interest in the study of Parliament. Through my research and my engagement over many years with parliaments, including parliamentary committees, I've met and I've engaged with many parliamentary officers. I have never interacted with one who did not epitomise professionalism. I see them as the unsung heroes of our parliament. I know that they can't go public. I appreciate all the restrictions around that, but I just think occasionally we really should be able to acknowledge all that the parliamentary officers do for the Australian community. And I think the ASPG is one of the times when you can actually say, thank you, well done, and how much we appreciate your efforts that go on behind the scenes. And on that note, I'm going to say goodbye for now, and I'm going to hand over to the ASPG's National President, Dr. Isla Macphail. Thank you.
Just unmuting. I'm enormously honoured to be taking on the role of President of the Australasian Study of Parliament Group. I have a long-standing interest in parliaments and a genuine reverence for their bedrock role in democratic systems. A small confession here. As a 15-year-old, I used to harass my father to drive me to the Parliament of Western Australia so that I could watch proceedings from the public gallery, about 100 metres from where I'm sitting now. And in the same year, when my parents took me along on their dream trip to Europe, which included a one-day stop en route in Melbourne, I insisted that we cut short our visit to the Fitzroy Gardens so that we could go and watch some debate in the Legislative Assembly of the Parliament of Victoria. From memory, unfortunately, the debate was about heavy metal poisoning in Port Phillip Bay. So yes, I was that person. But following the completion of a PhD examining Western Australia's parliamentary and constitutional development in the context of 19th century liberalism, plus 15 years as an officer of the Parliament of Western Australia, I trust I can bring more than just nerdy schoolgirl enthusiasm to the role of ASPG President. I should like to share a few of my ideas to grow the ASPG, but before doing so, I would like to put on the record some thank yous. First, Victoria. To both the Parliament of Victoria and the Victorian chapter of the ASPG, you have done an exceptional job with this conference. The seminar topics have been interesting and significant. Your roll call of presenters was extremely impressive, and the IT support was first rate. This has been an incredibly worthwhile and engaging conference, but to have pulled it off in the context of a pandemic, with Melbourne holding the record as the most locked down city in the world, it is a sensational achievement. So bravo, Victoria. Bravo. I should also like to express appreciation to some departing ASPG Executive Committee officers. Malcolm Prentice has been the ASPG National Treasurer since 2016. Malcolm is also the Chief Financial Officer of the ACT Legislative Assembly, although only for about another hour, as he is actually retiring today. Malcolm, thank you so much for your meticulous oversight of all the ASPG's financial affairs for the past 6 years, and all the best for your post-parliamentary life. I would also like to thank Sharon Beardsall, Management Accountant at the Queensland Parliament, who has volunteered to step up into that role. I would like to thank Professor Rodney Smith, who took on the editorship of the Australasian Parliamentary Review in 2017, and in something of a baptism of fire, oversaw the launch of the journal in its new online format with his first issue. Editing the journal is a demanding and time-consuming commitment, and given that during his editorship, Rodney was also teaching, researching, and publishing at the University of Sydney, his high-level support for the ASPG has been beyond impressive. Taking over the role of editor of the Australasian Parliamentary Review is Dr. Sarah Morgs, a senior lecturer in law at the University of South Australia, an executive member of the International Parliamentary Engagement Network, and a member of the Human Rights Advisory Panel for the Queensland Parliament. Sarah has a deep interest and great expertise in parliamentary matters and has already developed an exciting strategic plan for the journal. So welcome aboard, Sarah. And now for our immediate past president, Professor Colleen Lewis. Now, I hope that I won't embarrass Colleen or myself by being too effusive when talking about Colleen's extraordinary contribution to the ASPG over the past decade. But I do note that the New South Wales Legislative Assembly Speaker, Honourable Jonathan O'Dea, in his seminar yesterday, paid tribute to Colleen's well-earned and esteemed reputation for a culture of service. Colleen was a co-editor of the Australasian Parliamentary Review in 2013, editor of the Australasian Parliamentary Review from 2014 to 2017, and president of the ASPG since 2015, which I would like to point out means Colleen was simultaneously editor and president from 2014 to 2017. Most people would have been buried by this workload, but Colleen still managed to produce impeccably researched and thoughtful papers on governance and accountability for the Australasian Parliamentary Review and ASPG conferences, which is not surprising considering Colleen's day job was that of distinguished academic and much sought after political commentator. Whilst president for ASPG, Colleen was also an associate of the Centre for Public Sector Integrity and a member of the Accountability Roundtable. During her tenure as ASPG president, Colleen oversaw a constitutional review of the ASPG, which resulted in the implementation of a new and more equitable funding model for the group, a website review and revamp, and the introduction of the online format of the Australasian Parliamentary Review, which has resulted in a journal which is searchable, but also economically and environmentally more sustainable. It is important to pay tribute to Colleen's substantive achievements, but it is also important to acknowledge Colleen's fundamental niceness as a person. I don't think I've ever seen meetings chaired with such sublime efficiency, yet with such a civil, respectful, and collegiate vibe. As Vice President of the ASPG for the past few years, I have been privileged to have a masterclass in how to lead an organisation. So thank you, Colleen, for your culture of service. My final thank you is to Cheryl Samuels, ASPG National Secretary. Although Cheryl is not leaving the ASPG executive, I would like to acknowledge her contribution as Secretary since 2017, and also more recently as the ASPG Web Manager. Cheryl has more than 30 years high-level experience with both the Parliaments of House of Representatives and the Parliament of New South Wales. Along with an undergraduate honours degree in political science, Cheryl holds a Master of Public Administration, and I can confirm that Cheryl is unquestionably a Master of Administration and does a consummate job as the group's National Secretary. With respect to my aims for the ASPG as its president, in the first instance, very pragmatically, the group needs to regroup to where it was before COVID hit in early 2020. Over the last 2 years of lockdowns and lockouts, it has been extraordinarily difficult to host chapter events. Last year, only 4 of the 9 ASPG chapters held in-person events, 4 chapters were unable to hold any events, and 1 chapter hosted an online seminar only. Unsurprisingly, memberships of the chapters has dropped off. But I think we can be optimistic now about the future. And hey, even here in the Hermit Kingdom, we dispensed of indoor mask wearing as of today. The WA chapter of the ASPG has had Anthony Green semi-booked to come to Perth for the past 12 months to do a post-mortem on last year's WA state election. And I'm now feeling confident that we can get Anthony over later this year to, well, post-mortem this year's federal election. So getting chapter events up and running when we can is the first step to getting the chapters back up to speed. And having an in-person conference in Perth next year will be a very positive move, It will be the ASPG's first national gathering in 4 years. WA will definitely be pulling up all the stops to make it a banger of a conference, and we will advise the conference dates as soon as we can. Essentially, we have to wait for the New Zealand and Australian parliaments to table their parliamentary schedules for 2023. But as a heads up, the date will revert to sometime in the second half of 2023, as this is the customary timeframe for ASPG conferences. As for the conference theme, it has been focus grouped as I speak. If it gets up, it will be relevant and challenging, and in part philosophical. And they're the T's and N's. Beyond these immediate aims, I should like to see the ASPG grow. Referring to the group's constitutional objectives, I'm keen to foster our relationship with, our exchanges and dialogues with academia, especially those academics working in the area of parliamentary studies, governance, accountability, and public policy. I would like to see more of our seminars and research papers uploaded to the ASPG website and made available for general access, and also as aids for high school politics and legal studies teachers. I would like us to engage more with the media and increase the group's public profile. And I would like to strengthen links with other parliamentary organisations and think tanks, such as the International Parliamentary Engagement Network, the Australian Political Studies Association, and the UK and Canadian Study of Parliament groups. Indeed, as the WA Chapter Secretary, I've already trialled some preliminary engagement with the Canadian Study of Parliament group. A couple of months ago, they very generously allowed WA ASPG members to participate in one of their half-day online seminars free of charge. And I would very much like to encourage involvement from South Pacific parliaments in the ASPG's conferences and publications. The New Zealand and Australian legislatures already have partnerships with South Pacific parliaments under the aegis of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and I think the ASPG can leverage and foster these relationships. Finally, I'd be very glad to hear your suggestions. So please, if you have any, contact me. My details are on the ASPG website. And on that note, thank you again to the Victorians for an absolutely sensational conference. I look forward to welcoming you all next year in Perth for the 2023 ASPG conference. And I will now hand over to the President of the Victorian Legislative Council, Honourable Nazih Elasmar, to close proceedings. Thank you.
A few days ago, I had the pleasure of officially opening the 2022 ASPG conference. Now the time has come to bring the proceedings to a close. Unlike the recent Olympic and Paralympic Games, we have no flame that slowly flickers out to signal the end. Just some words of thanks and congratulations for the work that you have done this week. This conference was all about people, the organizers, the presenters, the moderators, the panelists, the audience. I hope that you all, and I'm sure you gained something from the discussions that you have held this week. People also lie at the very core of the topics you have talked about, because as I said in my opening remarks, public trust underpins the checks and balances that are the foundations of our parliamentary systems. Without people, parliaments are just grand structures, lacking purpose and soul. The purpose and soul of this conference were the wise words, the many questions, and the rigorous exchange of ideas in which you all participated. Parliamentary democracies evolve over time, and they must move with the times to remain relevant to the people they represent. The ASPG plays an important role in that evolution through the study of and debate about Parliament that it encourages. Departing this conference, please keep the conversations and dialogue going, because our parliaments can only benefit from more transparency, more questioning, more new ideas. In closing this conference, I ask you to remain open to the opportunities for ongoing exchanges on the topics that you have been discussing this week. Keep learning from each other, keep challenging each other to help us advance our parliamentary systems in the public interest and in the interests of democracy itself. I now officially close the proceeding of the 2022 ASPG conference and wish you all the very best. Thank you.